The call log still shows it. 4 names, 4 timestamps, 40 minutes, 2:47 p.m. on a Tuesday. All of them marked no answer. I was sitting in the parking lot of an urgent care clinic when I made those calls. I had just been told I would need a procedure in the next 72 hours. Nothing life-threatening, but significant enough that someone would need to drive me home from it. Not a complicated ask. A ride. A few hours of someone's afternoon. I called my mother first. It rang 5 times and went to voicemail. I called Marlene. Same. My brother. My father. I sat in the car and listened to each of them ring through and thought about how many Tuesday afternoons I had rearranged my own life because one of them had called me. I set the phone face down on the passenger seat. I sat there for a while in the flat light of a Tuesday afternoon in a parking lot I didn't know, with a procedure scheduled in 72 hours and no one to ask. Then I drove myself home. I didn't call again. I didn't text to explain what was happening. I scheduled the car service for the day of the procedure, and I handled it the way I had handled most things for 12 years, alone, quietly, without anyone knowing enough to have an opinion about it. But something in that parking lot had finished. I could feel it even then, sitting there with the phone face down, the engine still running. Not anger. Something quieter than anger. Something that had finally stopped waiting. It started with a conversation at the kitchen table when I was 28. My father's business was having a difficult quarter. Not failing, just stretched, the kind of thin that makes payroll uncomfortable. He didn't ask me directly. He laid out and looked at the table, and I told him I could cover a month while things stabilized. It was supposed to be 1 month. I remember thinking that clearly. I remember the specific confidence of thinking it. 1 month became 3. 3 became a year. And by then the shape of the arrangement had quietly changed into something neither of us had named at the kitchen table. My mother's car went. Then Marlene's mortgage hit a rough stretch that lasted 2 years. She was underwater on a house she'd bought at the wrong time, and the gap needed to be bridged. Then my brother's tuition came up short 1 semester, then 2. Then a dental procedure, a security deposit, a legal retainer for something nobody fully explained, a half dozen requests over a decade that each arrived framed as a specific, one-time, temporary exception, and that together formed something that wasn't any of those things. He never repaid me. I never asked. No one offered. The arrangement, for 12 years, was that it didn't need to be discussed. That was the word I would have used if anyone had pressed me. Arrangement. A practical structure between people who were close enough not to need paperwork. My mother called on Sundays. She was good at it. The call always opened the same way, with how proud she was, how well I was doing, how she told her friends about my job. There was warmth in it that I think was real. Then there would be a small pause, a practiced breath, and then the number. It was never framed as a request. It was always framed as something she was dealing with and wanted me to know about. I had learned to hear the number in the framing. Marlene texted every few months. The texts always started with "just letting you know," a phrase that had come to function over the years as a kind of financial notification alert I had set up without agreeing to. My father asked once a year, around tax season, quietly, apologetically, in the tone of a man who had decided that asking with sufficient humility made it a different kind of asking. Nobody outside the immediate family knew. I had kept it that way deliberately. I had told myself the privacy was a form of dignity for them, for me, for the version of us I wanted to preserve. I had been wrong about that. Privacy isn't dignity when the thing being kept private is the only record of what you've actually been doing. On a Saturday morning in February, I opened my banking records to file something routine. I was not looking for anything. I was not in a difficult mood. I opened the records, found the folder I needed, and then, for no particular reason I could name, I kept scrolling. I started adding up the transfers. I went year by year, back to the beginning, back to the kitchen table, and the 1 month that was going to stabilize things. I built a simple spreadsheet as I went, 1 row per year, the figures in a single column. It took about an hour. When I reached the present and looked at the total, I sat with it for a while. It wasn't the size of it, exactly, though the size of it was significant. What caught me was something else. The pattern. 12 years of records, and not a single month where nothing had moved. No gaps, no pauses, no period where things had apparently stabilized the way they were supposed to stabilize after that first month. Just 12 uninterrupted years of outflow, regular as a subscription, invisible as one. I set the laptop aside and looked at my apartment. It was a good apartment, clean, organized, everything where it should be. The apartment of a man who had been earning a decent salary for a long time. It was also the apartment of a man who had never gotten close to a down payment, who had taken approximately 3 vacations in a decade, who kept his savings in a number he didn't look at directly, because looking at it directly required acknowledging what it meant. 4 years ago, a relationship ended that I had wanted to keep. Money had been a part of it. Not the only part, but a part. She had asked me once, directly, why things always felt stretched. I had said something vague about expenses, about helping out family, and she had looked at me with the expression of someone deciding how long they were willing to wait for a complete sentence. I saved the spreadsheet. I labeled it with the date. I put it in a folder and closed the laptop. The following month, my mother called on Sunday. The call opened the way it always opened. Then the pause. Then the figure. I sent it the next day instead of the same evening, which was slower than usual. Nobody mentioned it. Nobody asked if something was wrong, or whether things were all right on my end, or whether I needed anything. The silence had the same texture it always had. A few months after I made the spreadsheet, I tried something small. We were at Sunday dinner, my parents' house, the usual arrangement, everyone at the table. I mentioned, in a gap in the conversation, that I had been thinking about a job opportunity. Early stages, nothing decided. It might involve relocating for a year. I kept it light. I was watching the table while I said it. My mother's smile didn't disappear. It tightened, a specific small adjustment that I recognized because I had grown up studying her face for exactly that kind of adjustment. Marlene put her fork down and asked, almost before I'd finished the sentence, what that would mean for the family situation. She said it that way, the family situation, as though it were an established term we all understood, which I suppose it was. My brother found something interesting on his plate. My father said nothing. After dinner, I was at the sink helping with dishes when Marlene came into the kitchen and positioned herself beside me in the specific way that meant the conversation was not optional. She kept her voice low. She told me that now wasn't a great time for big changes. She said our mother had been stressed. She said the business was in another difficult quarter. Then she said that everyone was counting on me to be steady. Steady. She said it the way you'd say it about a foundation. Not as a compliment to a person, but as a property you'd confirmed in load-bearing material. I heard it land, and I heard, clearly, what it actually meant. It meant available. It meant in place. It meant not somewhere else for a year, not reconfigured, not asking the rest of us to adjust. I nodded. I told her I was just thinking out loud. I finished the dishes and drove home and did not pursue the job. The following Sunday, my mother called. The call opened the way it always opened, and when the pause came, the figure was slightly higher than the previous month. She didn't explain why. I didn't ask. I sent it. I started seeing things differently after the kitchen conversation. Marlene posted photos of a vacation, a long weekend somewhere warm, a resort I recognized from the photos, the kind of place with a per-night rate I knew. She hadn't mentioned a trip was coming. I scrolled through the photos and didn't say anything. My brother mentioned, in passing at a family dinner, that he'd been looking at cars, that his current one was getting old, that he was thinking about something newer. My mother's living room had new furniture, a couch I didn't recognize, a rug, the kind of quiet refresh that meant someone had spent an afternoon making decisions. None of these things were wrong. None of them were any of my business. I looked at each of them the way I would have looked at anything else, and then I looked at them against the spreadsheet, and each one became a sentence in a paragraph I hadn't been meant to read. In the spring, there was a party at my cousin's house. Her birthday, a large gathering, the extended family spread across a backyard. A woman I didn't know well, one of my mother's sisters, found me near the drinks table and took my arm with genuine warmth. She told me how proud everyone was of how well I was doing. She said it the way family does, simply, fully meaning it. Then she said, almost in passing, that Marlene had been telling people for years how much I loved to help out. I kept my expression exactly where it was. She said it as a compliment. It was a compliment. It was also the first time I understood that the arrangement I had kept private, the thing I had protected because I thought the privacy was the dignity, had not been private at all. It had been circulating through the family in a managed form. A reputation. A story Marlene had been running for years on my behalf without asking me. That I was generous, that I loved to help, that the help was something I chose freely from a position of abundance. The story made her a good sister and made me a good brother and made the money a detail rather than a structure. I drove home from the party and opened the laptop. I pulled up the spreadsheet and added a column. I went back 12 years and tried to fill in every time any of them, my mother, Marlene, my brother, my father, had called or texted or shown up for a reason that wasn't financial. To see how I was. To offer something. To ask a question they didn't need an answer to for practical purposes. The column was short. I sat with that for a long time. 3 months after the party, I woke up at 5 in the morning with pain in my abdomen that was specific and wrong in the way that makes you stop pretending it's nothing. I drove myself to the nearest urgent care. After an exam and a scan, the doctor told me I had a condition that would require a procedure within the next 72 hours. Not life-threatening, she was clear about that, but real, and it required sedation, which meant I couldn't drive myself home afterward. I would need someone there. I went to my car and I made the calls. My mother. 5 rings, voicemail. My sister. 4 rings, voicemail. My brother. Straight to voicemail. My father. 6 rings, voicemail. I sat in the parking lot and looked at the call log. 4 names, 4 timestamps, 40 minutes. The last call ending at 3:27 p.m. on a Tuesday. I waited 20 minutes and tried each of them again. Same result. I sent a group text, short, factual, the name of the clinic, the situation, what I needed. The first reply came 6 hours later. My mother said she had been at a hair appointment with her phone on silent. She asked if I was okay. Marlene said she'd been in a meeting and wanted to know how serious it actually was. The phrase she used was how serious it actually is, as though seriousness were a claim requiring verification. My brother's text said he had seen the call come in, but assumed it was about money and had planned to call back later. Assumed it was about money. Was going to call back later. I read that sentence several times. I don't think he meant it the way it landed. I don't think he understood what he had written down and sent to me as a casual explanation. But it was the most honest thing anyone in my family had said to me in 12 years. It was in 7 words, the clearest possible description of what I had become to them and what they expected from any call with my name on it. My father didn't reply that day. I called a woman I worked with, someone I had known for 2 years, someone I had eaten lunch with maybe a dozen times, someone I would not have described as a close friend. She picked up on the second ring. I explained the situation. Without hesitation, she told me she would take the day off and drive me home. She did. She sat in the waiting room for 2 hours, drove me back to my apartment, made sure I got inside, and asked if I needed her to stay. I told her I was fine. I thanked her. She said it was nothing. I lay on the couch that afternoon and looked at the ceiling and thought about what it meant that the person who showed up was the one who had nothing to gain. I called a lawyer on a Monday morning. Not a family lawyer, not someone who knew anyone I knew. A stranger found through a search with an office across town. I made the appointment, gathered the spreadsheet and the list I'd been keeping, and went in on a Thursday afternoon and sat across from a man I'd never met and told him what I wanted. I wanted to formally end every financial arrangement I had with my family, in writing, in a way that closed the door with a date on it. I wasn't looking to sue anyone. I wasn't looking for repayment. I had thought about the repayment question carefully and decided it wasn't what this was about. I wanted the door closed. He asked his questions in the careful, unhurried way that lawyers do. Were any of the arrangements in writing? No. Were any of them legally enforceable? No. He looked at the spreadsheet for a moment and then looked up and asked me, evenly, what I actually needed a lawyer for. I thought about it. It was the most direct question anyone had asked me in a long time. I told them I needed a witness. Someone who would sit in a room with me and sign a document on a specific date, so that the moment was real and fixed and had a record, so that when my mother called on a Sunday afternoon, I couldn't revise what I decided in the space between her voice and my answer. I needed the decision to already exist somewhere outside my own head. He nodded. He said he understood. He drew up the document. On the first of the following month, I didn't send a transfer. I did it the way you do something you've decided, without ceremony, without a message, just the absence of the thing that had always been there. My mother called on the 2nd. I let it go to voicemail. She called again on the 3rd. On the 4th, I picked up and told her, calmly, that I wasn't sending a transfer this month, and that I'd be in touch in a few weeks to talk properly. She started to ask why. I told her I'd explain when we spoke, and that she didn't need to worry in the meantime. Then I got off the phone. She called back within the hour. Then again. Marlene called twice. My brother sent a text that said, "Call Mom." I put the phone face down on the counter and left it there. I texted the family on a Wednesday. I told them I needed everyone in my parents' house on Saturday afternoon. My mother, my father, Marlene, my brother. I didn't explain why. I asked them to be there. They were. My mother had set the dining room table with coffee and a plate of something she'd baked, the way she did when she wanted a visit to feel normal. I sat down. I didn't touch the coffee. I put a folder on the table in front of me, and I asked them to give me 15 minutes without interrupting. I said it once, clearly, and I waited until each of them had settled before I started. I walked them through it. The spreadsheet first. Year by year, figure by figure, the total at the bottom. I turned it so they could see it. Then the second column, the log I'd kept of every time in 12 years any of them had reached out for a reason that had nothing to do with money. The column that didn't take long to read. Then the Tuesday afternoon in the urgent care parking lot. I read out the timestamps. I named the 4 calls and what each of them had been doing when I made them. I read my brother's text aloud, the exact wording, without comment. Marlene tried to interrupt twice. The first time she said I was being unfair. The second time she said I didn't understand the situation. I stopped speaking, waited for her to finish, and then continued from where I'd left off. I didn't editorialize. I didn't raise my voice. I read from the document in figures and dates. When I was done, I told them what was going to happen. The transfers were stopping. Permanently. I wasn't asking for repayment. I had thought about that, and it wasn't what this was. I wasn't pursuing any legal action. I wasn't cutting anyone off. They were still my family. I'd be at holidays. I'd be at birthdays. I'd pick up the phone if any of them called because they wanted to talk to me. But the financial arrangement was closed. It had been open for 12 years without ever being named, and I was naming it now, in this room, and then I was closing it. I opened the folder and took out the document the lawyer had drafted. I signed it on the dining room table in front of all of them. I didn't ask them to sign anything. I just wanted them to see me do it, to see the date, to see that it was real. Marlene said I couldn't just do this. My mother said, "But we're family," and her voice broke on the last word. My father sat very still and then said, quietly, "Okay." My brother said nothing. He looked at the table the way he had at that dinner years earlier, when I'd mentioned the job and he'd found something interesting in his plate. I closed the folder. I stood up and thanked them for letting me speak. I had been family for 12 years, I said, and the family had been a customer. I was closing the account. The relationship was still open, if they wanted one that wasn't priced in. Then I left. The coffee was still hot. That night my phone ran hot for 4 hours. 17 calls. Most of them Marlene. The texts came in a sequence I could have predicted if I'd thought to predict it. Confusion first, then hurt, then a shift into anger, then the accusation that I was tearing the family apart. Then, around midnight, a softer message asking me to please reconsider, saying she knew I was upset but that this wasn't the way. Then, an hour after that, a final message that said I had always thought I was better than the rest of them. I read all of it. I saved all of it. I didn't reply to any of it. 3 days later, a letter arrived in my mailbox in my mother's handwriting, on the good stationery she kept in the desk drawer in the living room. It was long, and it was gentle, and it didn't dispute a single figure I had read at the table. She said she was proud of me. She said she hadn't realized how much it had added up to. She said she was sorry. Then she asked me not to punish the family for what she called a misunderstanding. I read it twice. I recognized the structure of it, the way it moved through acknowledgement and landed on reframe, the way sorry and misunderstanding appeared in the same document without any apparent tension between them. It was the best version of the response she knew how to write. I put it in the folder with the spreadsheet and the lawyer's document, and I didn't reply to that either. My father called a week later. I picked up. He didn't apologize. He didn't reframe anything. He said, slowly, that he had been thinking about the Tuesday afternoon, about the call he hadn't picked up. He told me he'd been napping. He said it plainly, not as an excuse, as a fact he'd been sitting with. He said that napping had been the reason. He said he didn't know how to make it right, but that he wanted me to know he'd heard what I said at the table. I thanked him. We stayed on the line for a moment without either of us saying anything. Then he told me he loved me. It was direct in a way he wasn't usually direct. Then he said goodbye and hung up. I put the phone down and sat in my apartment while the afternoon went late around me. The light changed, the room got dim, and I didn't move to turn a lamp on. Of everything that had come back to me in the week since I'd sat down at that table, the calls, the texts, the letter on good stationery, his 4 minutes on the phone was the only response that hadn't included a request or a defense or a careful repositioning of what had happened. He had just said what was true. That was all. It turned out that was the rarest thing anyone had offered me in 12 years. A year later, the math worked the way it was supposed to work. I had saved more in 12 months than in the previous 5 years combined. I had taken a vacation, 2 weeks, a place I had been looking at pictures of for a decade, the kind of trip I had always positioned in my mind as something I'd do eventually once things settled. Things had settled. I went. I came back and started looking seriously at buying a place. Not dreaming about it. Looking at listings, running numbers, calling a mortgage broker. The numbers made sense in a way they never had before. The family had reorganized around the change the way families do, not by addressing it, but by adjusting their positions relative to it. Marlene had, predictably, taken on the role of the one I had wronged. Word came through cousins that she had been telling a version of events in which I had abandoned the family during a difficult stretch for reasons she was too generous to fully explain. 2 cousins reached out to me separately, having heard her version, and asked directly what had happened. I sent each of them a short factual summary. The figures, the dates, the Tuesday afternoon. No commentary. One of them went quiet. The other wrote back and said, I wish you told us sooner. We would have helped. I noted which was which. My father called on a Sunday afternoon about a year after I'd signed the document. We talked for 20 minutes. He had been trying to fix something in the house, a repair he was doing slowly, in the wrong order, with the wrong tools, and with what sounded like genuine enjoyment. He'd been reading a book he couldn't remember recommending to me, but recommended anyway. He asked about the apartment search. I told him it was moving forward. There was no figure at the end of the call, no pause before a number, no careful framing. He said goodbye, and I told him I'd talk to him soon, and we hung up. I sat in my apartment in the quiet that followed. Made a coffee. Found the book I'd been reading. The phone on the counter didn't ring. I didn't look at it. I wasn't waiting for it to. For 12 years, the silence between calls had been a held breath. Something to fill. Something that meant waiting. Something that would end when someone needed me again. This silence was different. It was just a Sunday afternoon. Just the sound of city doing what cities do on Sunday afternoons. And a cup of coffee getting cooler beside me, and nothing that needed handling. That was the point. It had taken 12 years to get here, but that was the point. I'm over at where silence ends. Subscribe if any of this sounds familiar.